Good evening. Welcome to our Tzemach of the Tzemach Institute. My partner John Klein is not with me tonight. I understand he is toughing it somewhere in the mountains of North Carolina watching the leaves change. So therefore I'll be presenting our program tonight alone, and I want to talk about the situation that presently exists both in the United States and Israel, because we're very deep now into an election cycle. We're recording this program on the 21st of October, exactly 2 weeks from the date of the election here in the United States. And so in addition to that, Israel is also in a transition form, attempting to form a new government. The system in Israel is different than the United States, so we're not sure if they're going to elections at this time or not. The Prime Minister Levni is trying to form a government, and of course, obviously, we have here in the United States the struggle between the Republicans and Democrats, the Obama and the McCain attempting to convince us to vote for them and elect them. In any case, there's going to be new administrations established very, very soon, both in the United States and Israel. And so tonight I want to propose some new policies for new administrations. These policies will be hypothetical, not ones that I'm sure either Mr. McCain or Mr. Obama would implement. But I want to set these forth as hypothetical and biblically relevant policies that new administrations might embrace. First of all, we want to look at the reality that exists in the world. Some aspects of that reality, the world in general is very slow to deal with. And that causes turmoil, obviously, and ultimately God's judgment if we don't come to grips with it. One of those, and perhaps the most basic statements of reality, is that the nation of Israel exists in the world today. And from a biblical perspective, this is a dominant fact in both national and international policy, or it should be. The people of Israel have returned to the mountains of Israel, and as a result of that, Israel exists today as the seat of spiritual authority, blessing, and revelation in the world. And again, world leaders certainly don't recognize that, and even the Christian world is very, very slow to come to grips with that reality. But again, now we're speaking in hypothetical terms. And Israel is a force in the world today. God has declared it to be so. And just because the nations can't come to grips with it or have not been able to do that doesn't change it. Now, the fact of Israel is vitally important because Israel is that vessel through which God will intervene into the lives of men and women and to mankind in general. He has declared that to be the case, and so we must come to grips with that. Now, so Israel exists as a reality today, a spiritual reality, spiritual powerhouse, we might say. Now, contrast to that is that the United States today is the strongest nation, both economically and militarily, in the world. And I believe that we are known as the lone superpower in the world. And of course, what happens in Wall Street or what the U.S. military does, that power is projected all around the world. So then we have two poles of authority that we might consider as a basis of the reality that we're speaking about concerning policy, both on a national and international level. One of those is that the spiritual authority of revelation and righteousness is established in Israel today. That is a reality. The other is that the economic and military power of the world is centered, the real pole is centered in the United States. Now, I believe that it's God's will, if we can presume to know God's will, is that these two authorities, lines of authorities, would be aligned with one another. Both the spiritual authority centered in Israel and the military and economic power that is centered in the United States, that they would be aligned. And so we're going to propose some hypothetical policies that takes into account the alignment of these two poles of authority. Now again, these things that we're setting forth are hypothetical, and you might consider them naive and unrealistic, but from a biblical perspective, we believe that they are very realistic. Now, I personally believe that our nation, the United States, is very, very near God's judgment if we're not already deeply involved into that judgment. I believe that this is should be evident, especially from the economic upheavals that we've seen recently, and whether we're actually into that judgment or the judgment is coming. I believe it's true that we're ripe for that judgment, and so neither candidate for the highest office of this land is proposing anything that I would suggest would radically change that. I'm going to suggest some policies of a hypothetical new administration, which I believe has the possibility of staying the judgment that is probably already coming upon the nation. And again, I'm not suggesting that either a possible McCain or Obama administration would do these things. So this is what we're going to propose, both for Israel and for the United States. Now, we want first to look at the possible policy of Israel dealing with itself. In Israel, it's more of an internal thing than international thing relative to their policy. We're going to look at a few scriptures. I'm just going to read them briefly. They're coming from the book of Deuteronomy, and the words of Moses that are applied to Israel almost 3,500 years ago when Israel was first entering the land, or were about to enter the land, and we have God's stated will concerning Israel at that time. I believe that now, today, we are seeing Israel come out of the nations, the Jewish people returning to the mountains of Israel, and I believe that those very same policies reflect God's will concerning the Israeli people in the land of Israel today. I'm going to start by reading Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 1, and you follow along. We're going to summarize those on the screen. Moses said, "Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I am teaching you to perform, so that you may live and go in and take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, is given to you." So God's declaring to them through Moses, go in and take the land that I'm giving you possession of. Now, reading from Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 8 and 9, "You shall therefore keep every commandment which I am commanding you today, so that you may be strong and go in and possess the land into which you are about to cross over to possess it, so that you may prolong your days in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give to them and to their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey." So again, God is saying, go in and possess the land. Be sure to walk in these commandments that I'm commanding you, that you may prevail and overcome and live a long life in that land. Now, obviously, as Israel does this, God knew that they would meet opposition. They met opposition 3,500 years ago. They're meeting opposition today. So what is God's will concerning that opposition? We see that in chapter 20. I'm going to read verses 10 and 11. "When you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. If it agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you." Now, if they don't make peace, I'm not going to read the continuing verses, but if they don't make peace, then you're to trust the Lord, wage warfare, prevail and overcome, absolutely dominating your enemies. And then finally in chapter 31, verse 6, the Lord says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or tremble at them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not fail or forsake you." So we believe that, again, Israel is in the process of establishing a new government. None of the candidates that we see at the present time, possible candidates for leadership in Israel, would implement wholeheartedly the very things that we have read. But eventually we believe such a government will arise in Israel and will do just these things. We see that emerging actually in the people of Israel today. So the will, we believe, for God's people is to take the land, possess the land, especially Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, what the media and our United States policy calls the so-called occupied West Bank. That is the heartland of biblical revelation and authority. God said, "I will establish my name in this place." So God's will is for God's people who are returning from the nations to take the land, possess it, live in it. And if there's a resistance from that, they're to struggle against such a people, overcome them, prevail, either defeat them, destroy them, or drive them out. And obviously, if the opposing groups choose peace and choose to submit to the people of Israel and the land of Israel, then God says, embrace them and be peaceful toward them. Now, this is the policy that we believe should be implemented in Israel according to a biblical standard. Now, we want to turn to the United States. Again, within 3 months, a new administration is going to take control of the United States. Either Mr. McCain or Mr. Obama will lead that. We do not believe that either one will embrace the type of goals that we're going to set forth, but we believe that if this nation is going to avoid a further judgment and a severe judgment by the hand of God, new policies must be implemented soon in the future. And we're going to set forth what we believe to be some of those important policies. First of all, and the first policy would be that the United States would formally acknowledge that Israel represents that wellspring of spiritual strength, righteousness, and revelation in the world today that we spoke about before. It's vitally important, therefore, for the people of Israel to possess especially the land of Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem, which is the very heartland, the very heart of where God has revealed himself in the past and promised to reveal himself in the future. Okay, secondarily, that the United States, as the strongest economic and military power in the world, should ally itself completely with this source of spiritual strength, namely Israel, and that the United States policy should treat Israel as if it were the apple of God's eye. Now, I use that terminology because that's exactly what Zechariah called the Israel, and we believe that to be the case today. Now, a third point of policy that I want to suggest a hypothetical administration should set forth is to, number one, recognize that Islam is an extreme form of demonic control. That's ideology, theology of the Quran, ideology, and ethnic tradition, particularly Arabic ethnic tradition, and recognize that no lasting reform is possible of a Muslim nation. As a result of this, and coming to this, in other words, after 9/11, Mr. Bush argued repeatedly that Islam was a peaceful religion, and it simply is not so. And all you have to do is look at the fruit of that, wherever it is manifested in the world, to see the obviously fallacy of that. Mr. Bush did a great disservice to this nation by failing to recognize the real nature of Islam. As a result, we believe that the policy of this new hypothetical administration should be that no intervention into a Muslim nation would be, no venture into a Muslim nation would be made unless the threat is so great that the United States feels that it's imperative that we not only attack but overrun and suppress and occupy indefinitely. And I say that indefinitely in the sense that if the United States, for example, if the United States were to withdraw from Iraq today, I believe that within a year the most ruthless leadership that's available in Iraq would prevail and suppress all opposition, and we would have an administration in Iraq that looks very, very much like what was there before we arrived, that of Saddam Hussein. Now the names would be different, but the effect would be the same. Now that's true in most of the Muslim nations. So therefore, I believe it's imperative that this new hypothetical administration understands and recognizes the nature of Islam in this way. And unless the threat is so severe that absolute indefinite occupation is warranted, that we would simply stay out of there. Now, somewhere between a fourth and a third of the world population today is under Islamic domination, and so this is very, very important policy that a new administration needs to embrace. Okay, now we're turning more from international policy more to policy of national nature. We believe that this new hypothetical administration must aggressively root out unrighteous forces within the government itself. Unrighteous forces as judged from a biblical standard. Western civilization itself is based on the ethic code or code of ethics set forth in Torah and in the Bible in general. Attributes such as righteousness, hard work, individual responsibility, and enterprise. These ought to be established as a standard in our government that would serve as an example to the business world. It's very hard for our government to say to the Wall Street to straighten up their act when our government is more corrupt than Wall Street itself. So there's a problem, and the unethical, the greed, whatever, lying, cheating, whatever is possible in our government within the Beltway must be rooted out. Secondly, the power base of the Eastern establishment elite, I believe, must be rooted out. We have a vice president candidate, Mrs. Sarah Palin from Alaska, who the whole Eastern establishment is, back in Kentucky, we would use the word hissy. The whole Eastern establishment is having a hissy about Mrs. Palin. She's not qualified, they say, which really means she's not a part of that Eastern establishment. In my humble opinion, Mrs. Palin is the most qualified candidate for the highest office in this land of all the people that are currently on the slate. I wish she would dominate as president. She might possibly give some leadership in the vein that I'm speaking of today. And then there must be an aggressive campaign on the part of this new hypothetical administration to expose the corrupting influence of the media that is obviously very, very biased, and this would also include Hollywood. We have, for example, papers like the New York Times, which, I don't know who continues to subscribe to this thing. All right, now I'm going to subsequent policy This having to do with the multinational corporations that dominate, I guess, Wall Street today. Government policy of this new hypothetical administration must reduce the influence of these multinational corporations. Policy of the nation must be established on a biblical standard of right and wrong, good and evil, and not on the bottom line of business profit. The influence of corporations inside the Beltway is obviously far too great. Additionally, I'm listing a bunch of policies. I hope you can follow them. Additionally, there must be some balance established between individual rights and the rights of the community and of the country as a whole. Today we have an excessive emphasis on the rights of individuals, and as a result of that, there is this community, the local community, and the nation as a whole is suffering. We're talking about gay rights, we're talking about abortion rights, we're talking about the breakdown of discipline in the families, that's in both the home and in the schools. The things that we hear that goes on the basis of human rights in the schools today is terrifying. It should not be so. Here locally, just this week, a 12-year-old was arrested and locked up for striking his teacher. And maybe he was just throwing stuff at her. I don't know. It's crazy. If I did that sort of thing when I was in school, the teacher would have spanked me. She would take me to the principal's office. The principal would have spanked me, and then they would have sent me home, and then my dad would have really worked me over. And I'd had what country music calls an attitude adjustment. And this young man that they had to arrest, it was so violent that they had to arrest a 12-year-old. That is indicative of this excess in individual rights leading to destruction in our communities, schools, and in the nation as a whole. It should not be so. Finally, energy policy. This nation must embrace an energy policy with the fervor of the Manhattan Project of World War II to establish a reasonable energy independence. We must break away from our policy, our tie to the Middle East for energy, if there's any hope of establishing or avoiding this judgment that I believe is coming upon the United States. Now, I want to take now just a moment. I do not believe that either the McCain or the Obama administration, possible administration, will implement anything like this. I believe in both cases we'll see very much, pretty much a continuation of policy in most of these areas that I have listed. And the consequence of that is that I believe that our nation will continue to be weighed down in compromise and unrighteousness. And this will lead ultimately to two possibilities. The first possibility is that the U.S. will gradually be eclipsed by other emerging world powers and grow under their authority and influence, and that will be extremely odious to Americans. And I think we fail to. We see this happening in Europe already. Islamic control of Europe is increasing day by day, and ultimately Islamic law is going to be established in Europe, and it's going to be extremely odious to the Europeans. The same thing could very well happen here if there's not a change in direction. The other possibility, and maybe this is even more frightening, is that in our continued alliance or compromise with the other nations, and especially the Muslim nations, through our energy policy and our own pursuit of immorality, wealth, greed, sensuality, that the United States will continue in this cycle of godly judgment that will lead us to Armageddon. I would like for you to envision just for a moment U.S. troops, 82nd Airborne, 101st Airborne, Navy SEALs, elite Marine divisions, coming across the Jezreel Valley that you see. This picture is taken from Armageddon. facing off against Israeli troops at Armageddon, which the Bible predicts. If that's the case, your sons and daughters are going to perish according to Joel, in the valley of Jehoshaphat, the Emek Jehoshaphat, the valley where God is judge. I do not want to see that happening. I think there must be other possibilities. But for those possibilities to happen, to occur, to be implemented, there must be a change. Now, let's go back to Israel just a minute. Even though the present leadership of Israel doesn't show much hope of implementing real biblical values, there is emerging leadership in Israel that will. We see leadership in what we call the settlement movement that we believe that is prepared to implement God's purpose. If they do, God's blessing will be upon them. Israel is the only nation that has real assurance by God Himself that they will not only survive, but they will prevail. Now we must ask ourselves the question, is it possible that the United States will implement the types of policies that I outlined here? I doubt it very seriously, to tell you the truth. I suspect that the United States has already gone down the path to judgment. If you think the Eastern establishment elite are so smart, if this represents such wisdom, how is it that they have brought us into the state of condition that we're in today? The only possibility for the implementation of policies of the nature that I have outlined here today would be for a very bold political uprising all across the United States that would raise up to accomplish some of these objectives. I'm not talking about a forceful military or violent overthrow of the United States government. I don't think that would do any good. I'm talking about a popular political uprising that would implement some of the policies that I've outlined today. Frankly, I doubt very seriously if that's going to happen. And therefore, my prayer would be, Father, in your judgment and in your wrath, remember mercy. That's our program for today. Please come and join us in worship and teaching at the Tzemach Institute and at the Fellowship Church. Shalom.